It was one of those moments in life when you think everything is perfect. My name's Ryan, and my wife Emily and I seemed like the classic college sweethearts. We met during our sophomore year at Boston University. She was all brains and charm, the kind of girl everyone noticed in a crowded room. I was your average guy, but we clicked. Really clicked. We got married right after graduation, had a honeymoon in Spain, and life just felt easy. Emily's parents, Mark and Diane, were incredibly supportive. In fact, they helped us move into this stunning house right outside the city just a week after the wedding. It was in one of those fancy neighborhoods where everyone drives Teslas and has manicured lawns. And while our friends were still stuck in tiny apartments, we were living in a dream home, thanks to Mark, who practically ran one of the largest banks in the state. I wasn't complaining about my job either. I started working at the same bank where Mark was in charge. My official title? Clearing specialist. In simple terms, I handled transactions between companies, nothing too complicated, but it was enough to keep me busy without drowning me in work. Mark's influence over the company made sure my workload was light, and no one seemed to care much when I rolled into the office 20 minutes late each morning. Why was I late? Not because I overslept, but because I had developed this habit of swimming 5 kilometers every morning at the local gym. Yeah, 5 kilometers. My trainers were always pushing me to take it more seriously, but I told them it was just for fun. It wasn't like I wanted to become a pro swimmer. Still, it toned me up fast, and I had a pretty decent build by the time Emily and I got settled into our new life. But then, things took a turn. One evening, Emily and I were having dinner with her parents at their house. The evening started off casually: wine, small talk, the usual. The women were catching up on gossip, while Mark disappeared into the basement to grab some exclusive wine. I was about to join him when I hesitated and found myself alone in the kitchen. That's when I overheard something I was never supposed to hear. Emily was talking to her mom, Diane, about something that shook me to my core. "Mom," Emily said in a low voice, "we need to figure out what to do about Ryan. Dad's deal with Leonard is too big to mess up. But Ryan can't be involved. He's too well, he wouldn't get it. And Leonard, he's not going to want Ryan anywhere near the island. It's just going to complicate things." "Don't worry, honey," Diane replied. "We'll find a way to keep him out of the picture. Leonard's expecting both of us to be there, and he made it clear that Ryan should stay away. The whole project depends on it. And if he comes along, well, I can't exactly get to Leonard's bedroom with Ryan hanging around, can I?" My heart started pounding. Leonard? Bedroom? What the hell was going on? "We'll need to figure out how to distract him," Diane continued. "Maybe give him some sleeping pills, like you did at the wedding?" That worked out perfectly, and Leonard was so happy that night. And look where we are now, living in that gorgeous house. The money from Leonard paid for it, remember? "Yeah, you're right," Emily said with a chuckle. That plan worked like a charm. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mind raced back to our wedding night. I remember drinking champagne. Then everything went blank. I woke up the next morning feeling strange, like something had happened while I was out cold. Emily was next to me, groggy and distant, saying, "You wore me out last night." But something never felt right about that night. And now I was beginning to understand why. Leonard, her father's business partner, had been at the wedding, and it seemed he had played a much bigger role than I ever knew. Standing in the kitchen, feeling numb, I realized that the people I trusted most were keeping massive secrets from me. Emily and Diane continued their conversation, oblivious to the fact that I was still in the house, overhearing every word. It felt like my world was crumbling, but I couldn't confront them right then. I had to process what I just heard. Emily had gone so far as to betray me on our wedding night. And now, they were planning something even bigger with this Leonard guy. The question was, what the hell was I going to do about it? The air in the room suddenly felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. My heart was pounding so hard. I thought for sure they'd hear it from the other room. I quickly and quietly slipped out of the kitchen and made my way to the garden. I needed a moment to think, to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. Should I confront Emily? Should I talk to her dad? Or maybe I should just walk away from this entire life I thought was perfect but clearly wasn't. As I stood there, pretending to admire the flowers in their immaculate garden, Emily found me. She was all smiles, completely unaware that her entire double life had just unraveled in front of me. "Isn't it beautiful out here, Ryan?" she said, slipping her arm around mine. "I love how nature just gets everything right." I forced a smile, trying to mask the storm brewing inside me. "Yeah, it's something." "Come on," she said, tugging my arm. "Dad's back with the wine. Let's head inside." I followed her, every step feeling heavier than the last. We rejoined Mark and Diane at the table, and as we sat down, Mark carefully opened the bottle of wine he had brought up from his exclusive collection. The cork popped, the glasses were filled, and the small talk resumed. But I wasn't really listening. My mind was racing, going over what I had overheard, replaying it again and again. At some point, Mark lifted his glass and said, "To family." I froze for a second, wondering how I could possibly toast to something that felt like a complete lie. But I raised my glass anyway, clinking it with everyone else's before taking a sip. The wine tasted sour in my mouth, and all I wanted to do was get the hell out of there. Emily must have noticed something was off. She leaned in and whispered, "Are you okay? You've been quiet." "I'm fine," I lied. "Just tired from work. Long day." "Why don't we get out of here soon?" she suggested. "You can rest, and we can just chill at home." "Yeah, that sounds good," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't want to tip her off, not yet. Not until I figured out my next move. The evening dragged on longer than I would have liked. Mark and Diane seemed intent on keeping the conversation going, and every minute I spent there, sitting across from them, made my blood boil a little more. But eventually, we said our goodbyes, and Emily and I made our way back home. The drive was silent, neither of us speaking much. I could feel her glancing at me occasionally, probably wondering what was going on in my head, but I wasn't ready to let her in on that yet. When we got home, Emily went straight to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the evening in my mind. My trust in her was shattered. How could I have been so blind? And what did this mean for our future? The next morning, I made up an excuse to get out of the house early. Emily was still asleep when I left, heading straight to the one place where I knew I could get some answers, the molecular genetics lab downtown. The previous day's bombshell had opened my eyes to some things I couldn't ignore, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it all. At the lab, I dropped off 2 hair samples, one from Emily and one from Mark. I had quietly taken them the night before, and now I was handing them over for a paternity test. It wasn't cheap, but I didn't care. I needed to know the truth. There was no way I was going to sit by while they all played me for a fool. I made sure to pay extra to expedite the results. 3 days later, I got the call. The results were ready. My hands shook as I opened the envelope, but when I read the words, my suspicions were confirmed. Emily wasn't Mark's daughter. She wasn't even biologically related to him. I should have been shocked, but in a way, I had expected it. This whole time, I had been living in some twisted version of reality, surrounded by people who thought they could manipulate me into doing whatever they wanted. But I wasn't about to let that happen. Now that I had the truth in my hands, the next step became clear. It was time to figure out what the hell Mark and Leonard were really up to. And more importantly, I needed to figure out how I could turn the tables on them. I started going through the bank's records more closely, paying attention to every detail. Mark's bank accounts were clean on the surface, but there were a few transactions that caught my eye. Transfers to offshore accounts, hidden in shell corporations with ties to some very shady people. And there was one name that kept popping up, Leonard. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Mark and Leonard were running a massive scheme, skimming millions off of government contracts and funneling the money into their own private empire. But there was more. They weren't just stealing money. They were playing with powerful people's money. And from what I could tell, these were the kinds of people you didn't cross without consequences. Emily, meanwhile, was busy getting ready for their big trip to Leonard's Island, where they planned to finalize their latest business deal. I knew that this trip was key to everything, and I had no intention of letting them carry it out without keeping a close watch. I purchased a few small recording devices and sewed them into the lining of my jacket. Emily never paid much attention to what I wore, so I figured it would be easy to slip by unnoticed. I also picked up a set of handcuff keys and tucked them away, just in case things got out of hand. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I wasn't about to go in unprepared. The day of the trip arrived, and we set off. First, we took the train to New York, then boarded a private plane that flew us to some remote location near a massive lake. The air was thick with tension, but I kept my cool, playing along like nothing was wrong. As we got closer to the island, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to step into something much bigger than I ever imagined. When we arrived at the lake, a security guard was waiting to take us to the dock. The island was about 10 kilometers out, surrounded by deep water, and the only way to get there was by a boat that ran once a week. No cell service, no television, nothing. Just us, isolated on an island in the middle of nowhere. As the boat sped toward the island, I casually asked the guard, "Does a cell phone work out here?" "Nope," he said. "Once you're on that island, the only communication you've got is a satellite phone. And even that's not too reliable. No TV signals either." I nodded, playing it cool. But inside, I was on high alert. I knew I was walking into the lion's den, and the only way out was to keep my wits about me. As the island came into view, I saw the main house, Leonard's so-called modest estate. It was anything but modest, with multiple buildings, including a guest house and what looked like a private security post. My instincts were screaming at me to be cautious. Leonard was there to greet us when we arrived, shaking Mark's hand, hugging Diane, and giving Emily a kiss on the cheek. He turned to me and smiled, shaking my hand firmly. "Welcome to my little retreat, Ryan," he said, his voice smooth and confident. I smiled back, but my mind was already racing. I was in deep now, and there was no turning back. As we stepped off the boat and onto the island, Leonard led us through a winding path towards the house. It was even more impressive up close, 3 stories tall, with large windows that looked out over the lake. I could see the other buildings behind it, guest houses, a pool house, and even a private dock. It was clear this was a place for people who lived far above the law. People like Leonard, Mark, and apparently my wife. "Make yourselves at home," Leonard said, gesturing around as we entered the house. "There's plenty of space, and the staff will be around to help with anything you need. Most of them are heading back to the mainland tonight, though, so it'll just be us and a skeleton crew for the weekend. I find it's more relaxing that way. No distractions." No distractions. Of course. That's exactly what they wanted. No witnesses. No way to call for help if things went south. I had to stay sharp, but I played it cool, nodding along as Leonard gave us the grand tour of the house. Our room was on the 2nd floor, a massive suite with a king-size bed, its own bathroom, and a view that looked out over the water. Emily was excited, unpacking our bags as if this was just another vacation. But I could see in her eyes that she was tense. She knew the real reason we were here, even if I hadn't let on that I knew too. After the tour, Leonard announced that dinner would be served soon, and we all gathered in the massive dining room. The food was incredible, cooked by Leonard's personal chef, and the wine was flowing freely. But every bite tasted like poison to me. I couldn't stop thinking about what was coming after dinner. Emily had already hinted that she'd be heading to Leonard's room that night, and the thought of it made me feel sick. Halfway through the meal, Leonard leaned back in his chair and said, "So, Ryan, how's work treating you? I hear you've been making quite a name for yourself at the bank." I forced a smile. "It's going well, thanks. Just trying to keep up with everything." "I'm sure you're doing great," Leonard replied, his tone smooth but with an edge of condescension. "Mark has told me a lot about you. Says you're a natural at handling the financial side of things. You must be proud." "Yeah, well, I learned from the best," I said, glancing at Mark. He smiled back, but it felt more like a wolf baring its teeth than a father-in-law showing support. Leonard's eyes narrowed, as if he was sizing me up. "You know, Ryan, we have some big plans in the works. Some really lucrative opportunities. I'm sure Mark has mentioned them." I shook my head. "No, not really. He keeps me out of the loop on the big stuff." "Ah, that's a shame," Leonard said with a smirk. "Well, maybe it's time we bring you into the fold. You seem like someone who could appreciate the finer things in life." The way he said it made my skin crawl. He wasn't just talking about money. There was something darker behind his words. But I kept my cool, nodding politely as the conversation moved on. Inside, though, I was boiling. Whatever scheme they had cooked up, I was determined to find out more. After dinner, Leonard excused himself and went upstairs. Emily gave me a long, uneasy look before standing up and following him. My chest tightened as I watched her go, disappearing down the hall. It was happening. She was going to his room, just like she had said. And there I was, expected to act like nothing was wrong. Like this was all part of some normal business deal. Mark and Diane stayed in the dining room, chatting and finishing off their wine. I excused myself, claiming I needed to get some fresh air. Once outside, I paced around the property, trying to clear my head. But all I could think about was Emily and Leonard, and how this entire situation had spiraled out of control. Eventually, I made my way back inside, but I didn't go straight to our room. I had a plan. Quietly, I slipped upstairs and into Leonard's office. It was a large, dark room, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a massive oak desk. I had already scoped it out earlier and placed a small recording device under the desk. Now, I needed to plant a second one. I moved quickly, scanning the room for a good spot. I settled on a bookshelf near the door, where the small device would be hidden behind a row of old leather-bound books. With that done, I headed back downstairs, trying to act as casual as possible. The next few hours were a blur. I wandered around the house, trying to avoid any more awkward conversations with Mark or Diane. Eventually, I went to our room, but Emily still wasn't back. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for her to return. It was nearly 3 in the morning when I heard the door creak open. Emily slipped into bed beside me, her movements slow and tired. She didn't say a word, and neither did I. We lay there in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on us. I wanted to ask her what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Maybe I didn't want to hear the answer. The next morning, Emily acted like everything was normal. She got up, showered, and dressed, all without mentioning what had happened the night before. I played along, pretending that nothing had changed, but deep down, I knew things would never be the same. Over the next couple of days, I kept my distance, observing the others as they carried on with their business. Mark and Leonard spent hours holed up in Leonard's office, talking in hushed tones about their latest scheme. I kept an eye on them, waiting for the right moment to collect the recordings I had planted. On the final night, things took a turn I hadn't expected. We were all sitting down for dinner when Leonard suddenly addressed me directly. "Ryan," he said, setting down his wine glass. "There's something I need to talk to you about. Emily and I had a conversation, and I think it's time we clear the air." I stiffened, glancing at Emily, who looked down at her plate, avoiding eye contact. Leonard continued, "I want to make you an offer. $100,000. That's how much I'm willing to pay for Emily to spend the weekend with me. And I don't mean just dinner and conversation. You know what I'm talking about." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He was offering to buy my wife, right in front of me. It was disgusting, degrading. And the worst part? Emily didn't say a word. She just sat there, staring at her plate, as if she had already accepted this twisted deal. I leaned back in my chair, staring Leonard down. $100,000? I said, my voice low and controlled. "That's what you think she's worth?" Leonard smiled, clearly thinking he had the upper hand. "It's a generous offer, Ryan. More than fair, considering the circumstances." I glanced at Mark, who was watching me closely, as if waiting for my reaction. He had been in on this from the beginning, I realized. This was all part of their plan. They had used me, manipulated me, and now they thought they could buy me off. I pulled out a folded piece of paper from my pocket and slid it across the table toward Leonard. "That's a paternity test," I said. "Emily isn't even Mark's daughter. She's been lying to all of us." For the first time, Leonard's smile faltered. He picked up the paper, scanning it quickly. Mark's face turned pale as the realization hit him. This wasn't just some game anymore. The stakes had just been raised. The silence that followed was suffocating. Leonard's smirk had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stare. Mark looked stunned, his eyes darting between the paternity test and me. Diane sat frozen, as if her entire world had been flipped upside down in an instant. But Emily, she was the one who stunned me the most. She didn't look shocked, or even upset. She just sat there, staring blankly at the table, like none of this was news to her. "So," I said, breaking the silence, 100 grand, huh? That's what you're offering me for my wife?" The same wife who isn't even Mark's daughter. Leonard's hand tightened around the paternity test. This doesn't change anything, he said, his voice icy. You're in no position to negotiate, Ryan. You should consider yourself lucky that I'm offering you anything at all. I could feel the anger bubbling up inside me, but I kept my cool. I wasn't going to let them see how much this had shaken me. Not yet, anyway. I glanced at Emily, still waiting for her to say something, to defend herself, to explain any of this. But she just sat there, as if she'd resigned herself to whatever fate Leonard and Mark had planned for her. I leaned forward, locking eyes with Leonard. You think I'm just going to sit here and take this? That I'll let you walk all over me and my marriage? You've got no idea who you're dealing with. Leonard chuckled darkly, leaning back in his chair. You're out of your depth, kid. You have no idea how this world works. But I'll give you one last chance. Take the money and walk away. You're already in too deep. Before I could respond, Emily finally spoke up. Her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper. Ryan, maybe it's best if we just end this. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I turned to her, my mind racing. End this? You mean us? Are you seriously saying that? She nodded, her eyes still fixed on the table. I've made mistakes. I've done things I'm not proud of. But this is bigger than us. It's about my family. About protecting them. Protecting them? I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Her family had been lying to her for years. They'd manipulated her, used her, and now they were willing to sell her off like some kind of commodity. And she wanted to protect them? You can't be serious, I said, my voice low with disbelief. After everything you've put me through, you still want to protect them? She looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw the pain in her eyes. It's not that simple, Ryan. You don't know everything. There's more at stake here than you realize. I know enough, I shot back. I know that you've been lying to me since the day we got married. I know that your father isn't really your father, and I know that you've been involved in whatever scheme Leonard and Mark are running behind the scenes. What I don't know is why. Why would you go along with all of this? Why didn't you tell me? Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away. I didn't have a choice. You have no idea what it's like to be part of this family, to grow up with the kind of pressure they put on me. Everything I've done was to protect us, to make sure we stayed on top. You don't just walk away from people like Leonard. He's not someone you say no to. I stared at her, trying to wrap my head around what she was saying. Leonard wasn't just some rich business partner. He was dangerous. And somehow, Emily had gotten herself caught up in whatever twisted game he was playing. Mark finally spoke up, his voice trembling. Ryan, you don't understand how powerful Leonard is. He can destroy everything. Our bank, our family, everything we've built. We've worked too hard to let it all fall apart now. Destroy everything? I repeated, shaking my head. Maybe if you weren't stealing millions from government contracts and laundering it through offshore accounts, you wouldn't be in this position in the first place. Diane gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. How do you know about that? I'm not an idiot, I said, glaring at Mark. I've been digging through the bank's records for weeks. You think I didn't notice the shady transactions? The shell companies? The offshore accounts? You're both knee-deep in this, and now you're dragging Emily down with you. Mark's face went pale. Ryan, please. You don't know what you're getting yourself into. This isn't just about money. There are people, very powerful people, who will come after us if this falls apart. People who won't hesitate to kill to protect their interests. Leonard remained calm, watching me with those cold, calculating eyes. You're in over your head, Ryan, but it's not too late to get out. Take the money. Walk away. I can make sure you never have to worry about any of this again. I stood up, pushing my chair back. You think you can buy me off? That you can just pay me to forget everything I've seen? You've already taken everything from me. My marriage, my trust, my future. You think $100,000 is going to make that go away? Leonard's eyes darkened, and I could see that I had pushed him too far. You don't understand what you're doing, Ryan. If you don't take this deal, you're going to regret it. I leaned over the table, locking eyes with him. I'm already regretting a lot of things, but the one thing I won't regret is bringing you down. With that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving them all in stunned silence. My heart was pounding, adrenaline rushing through my veins. I had just declared war on people who had far more power and resources than I could ever imagine. But I didn't care. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. Not anymore. I went back to our room, grabbed my things, and left the house. Emily didn't try to stop me. As I walked out into the cool night air, I felt a strange sense of relief. The truth was out, and I was done playing their game. But I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. I left the house with my heart racing, each step pulling me further away from the web of lies and manipulation I'd been caught in. But as I walked down the path toward the dock, my mind was already racing with what I had to do next. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The island was quiet, except for the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. The boat we had taken to get here was gone, and the security guard had told me earlier that there wouldn't be another one for a week. No communication. No escape. They had planned it that way, but they hadn't planned for me to find out their secrets. And they definitely hadn't planned for me to fight back. I glanced back at the house, its lights glowing through the trees. I knew I couldn't confront them outright. Not yet. Leonard was powerful, and Mark was desperate. If I wanted to survive this, I had to be smart. I had to play my cards right. I headed toward the guest house, my mind whirling with ideas. I still had the recordings from Leonard's office. They were my ace in the hole, the proof I needed to expose their whole operation. But I had to get off this island first. That was priority number one. As I walked past the pool house, I noticed something strange, a large inflatable swan floating lazily in the water. It gave me an idea. I had swum 5 kilometers every morning at the gym. What was another 10? The lake was big, but not impossible to cross. And if I could use the inflatable to carry my things and stay afloat, I might just make it. I hurried over to the pool, dragging the swan out of the water. It was a bit silly, but I didn't care. This was my best chance at getting off the island without them knowing. I stuffed my clothes and belongings into waterproof bags, securing them to the swan. Then, taking a deep breath, I pushed the swan into the lake and slipped into the water beside it. The cold water hit me like a shock, but I focused on my breathing, steadying myself. I grabbed the swan's neck and began kicking, propelling us forward into the dark expanse of the lake. The house disappeared behind me as I swam, the island shrinking in the distance. My only guides were the stars above and the dim lights of the mainland far ahead. The swim was grueling. The distance was more than I'd ever tackled in the pool, and the cold sapped my strength faster than I expected. But I pushed through, focusing on each stroke, each kick. Every minute that passed was a minute closer to freedom. Halfway across, I spotted something moving in the water nearby. My heart jumped in my throat. A fish, I told myself. Just a fish. But my mind raced with other possibilities. Something bigger, something dangerous. I shook the thoughts away. There were no sharks in this lake. No monsters waiting beneath the surface. Just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, I swam faster, the inflatable swan dragging behind me as I powered through the final kilometers. Finally, after what felt like hours, I felt my feet touch the lake bed. I had made it. My legs shook as I waded onto the shore, collapsing onto the sand. I lay there for a moment, catching my breath, staring up at the stars in disbelief. I had actually done it, but there was no time to rest. I had to keep moving. The house was still there, still full of dangerous people who would realize soon enough that I was gone. I couldn't let them catch me. Not before I had a plan. I dried myself off with a towel I had stuffed in one of the bags, changed into dry clothes, and set off toward the nearest road. The lake's shore was deserted, but I knew there was a small town a few miles away. I had passed it on the drive-in. If I could make it there, I could find a ride, get to a phone, and start putting my plan into action. As I trudged along the dark, empty road, I thought about everything that had happened. Emily, Mark, Leonard. They had all lied to me, used me. And for what? Money, power, control. But I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I had the recordings. I had the proof. Now I just needed to figure out how to use it without getting myself killed. An hour later, I finally reached the town. It was small, barely more than a few streets lined with houses and a couple of stores. But it had what I needed, a diner that was still open, even at this late hour. I walked in, the bell over the door jingling as I stepped inside. The place was empty, save for a tired-looking waitress behind the counter. She looked up as I approached. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat with exhaustion. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual despite the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. "I could really use a ride. Do you know anyone around here who could give me a lift to the airport?" She eyed me suspiciously, probably wondering why a guy like me would be wandering in at this hour, soaked to the bone, asking for a ride in the middle of nowhere. But then her expression softened, and she nodded. "My brother's heading into the city in a couple of hours," she said. "I can ask him to drop you off. It's on his way." "That would be great," I replied, relief washing over me. I ordered a cup of coffee and sat at one of the booths, watching the rain start to fall outside. The storm that had held off during my swim had finally arrived. I couldn't help but think about what was happening back on the island. They would have noticed I was gone by now. Leonard would be furious. But there was nothing they could do, at least not until they found me. As I waited for the ride, I pulled out my phone and listened to the recordings. The conversations were even worse than I had imagined. Leonard and Mark were not just laundering money. They were involved in something far bigger, something that went all the way to the top. The names they mentioned, the deals they were making, this wasn't just some petty crime. This was a full-blown criminal empire. I knew I was sitting on a ticking time bomb. The recordings were my ticket out, but they were also a death sentence if I didn't handle them carefully. If Leonard found out I had them, he'd stop at nothing to take me down. Finally, the waitress's brother arrived, a gruff-looking guy with a beat-up truck. He didn't ask any questions as I climbed in and gave him directions to the airport. The drive was quiet, the rain tapping against the windshield as we sped through the dark streets. I kept glancing at my phone, feeling the weight of the recordings in my pocket like a ticking bomb. When we finally pulled up to the airport, I thanked the guy, paid him a bit extra for the ride, and headed inside. I bought a one-way ticket to Washington, D.C. If I was going to take down Leonard and Mark, I needed to go straight to the top. I knew just the person who could help me, Max, an old college friend who had risen through the ranks of the FBI. He owed me a favor, and I was about to cash in. As I boarded the plane, I felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. I had escaped the island, but the real battle was just beginning. Leonard and Mark weren't going to let this go quietly, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. As the plane took off, I leaned back in my seat, trying to process everything that had just happened. The hum of the engines and the dim cabin lights were a strange contrast to the chaos swirling in my head. I was on my way to D.C., clutching a phone full of explosive evidence that could take down one of the most powerful criminal networks I'd ever stumbled across. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. I checked my phone again, scanning through the recordings to make sure they were all intact. I had Leonard and Mark on tape discussing offshore accounts, bribes, and illegal government contracts. But the names they mentioned, the powerful figures behind the scenes, they were the real danger. This wasn't just about taking down a couple of rich crooks. This was about exposing a corrupt system that reached far beyond what I had imagined. I needed help, and fast. Max was my best shot. We hadn't talked in years, but if there was one person I could trust in this mess, it was him. We'd gone to college together, and back then, he was the guy who always knew how to fix things. Now, as an agent with the FBI, he had the connections and resources I needed to blow this whole thing wide open. I shot him a text as the plane started its descent into D.C. "Max, it's Ryan. We need to meet. Urgent. Got something that's going to shake things up. Can't talk over the phone. Too risky. Can you meet me at Union Station in an hour?" The response came almost immediately. "Ryan? Holy crap, man. It's been forever. I'm intrigued. Meet you there in an hour." Good. At least I had a plan. The rest of the flight passed in a blur, my mind focused on what I'd say to Max and how we could use the evidence to bring Leonard, Mark, and their entire operation to justice. When the plane landed, I grabbed my bag and headed straight for a cab, directing the driver to Union Station. The city lights flashed by as I leaned back, trying to calm my nerves. I knew I was about to drop a bomb on Max, but he was the only person I trusted to help me without asking too many questions. As I approached the station, my phone buzzed again. It was a message from Max. "Just got here. See you inside." I hurried through the crowded station, scanning the sea of faces until I spotted him near one of the benches. Max looked almost the same as I remembered, tall, sharp features, and that same calm, collected demeanor he'd always had. But there was something different about him now, a seriousness, a weight on his shoulders that hadn't been there before. I guess working for the FBI will do that to you. Ryan, he said with a grin as I approached, pulling me into a quick hug. It's been a minute, man. What's going on? You look like hell. Max, I said, my voice tight with urgency. I don't have time for small talk. What I've got, it's huge. Bigger than anything you've worked on. And it's dangerous. His grin faded, replaced by a look of concern. All right, let's take this somewhere quieter. We found a corner table in a nearby cafe, away from the crowds and prying eyes. Max sat across from me, his expression serious now. Start talking. I pulled out my phone and slid it across the table. I've got recordings, evidence that Leonard, Mark, and a bunch of other powerful people are running a massive criminal operation. Money laundering, government corruption, bribes, you name it, they're involved. Max's eyes widened as he scrolled through the files. Jesus, Ryan, how did you get all of this? It's a long story, I said, leaning in. But trust me, it's legit. They're not just stealing money. They're playing with some of the most dangerous people in the country. I barely made it out alive, and I have no doubt they're looking for me right now. If we don't move fast, they'll cover their tracks, and I'll be dead. Max stared at me for a moment, processing everything. You realize what you're asking for, right? If this is as big as you say, we're not just talking about a few arrests. This could take down entire corporations, maybe even politicians. I know, I replied. That's why I came to you. I can't do this alone. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. All right, I'll help you. But we need to be smart about this. If we go in guns blazing, they'll see us coming a mile away. Let me make a few calls, see who we can trust within the bureau. We need people who aren't on their payroll. I nodded, relieved that he was taking this seriously. What's the next step? I'll start digging on my end, Max said, already pulling out his phone to make a call. In the meantime, I need you to lay low. Don't contact anyone, don't go anywhere. If they find out you're here, it could get ugly fast. Lay low? I repeated, my voice tinged with frustration. I can't just sit around while these guys get away with everything. You won't, Max assured me. But if they find you before we're ready, it's game over. Trust me, Ryan. You don't want to mess with people like this until we have a solid plan. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. He was right, of course. But sitting around, waiting, wasn't my style. I'd already risked everything to get this far, and now I was supposed to hide? Max stood up, phone still in hand. Look, I'll get back to you as soon as I have something. For now, go check into a hotel, keep your head down, and let me handle this. I watched him walk away, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on me. The evidence was out there, but now it was in Max's hands. All I could do was wait. The next few days were some of the longest of my life. I stayed in a cheap hotel on the outskirts of the city, checking my phone obsessively for updates from Max. Each hour that passed without word felt like a lifetime. I kept thinking about Emily, about Leonard, about the house on that island. I wondered what they were doing now. If they had realized I was gone, if they had figured out that I had the recordings. Finally, on the third day, I got the call. Ryan, Max's voice was tense. We need to meet. Now, there's a lot more going on than we thought. I felt a chill run down my spine. Where? Meet me at the old warehouse on Pier 17. It's secure. I'll explain everything when you get here. The line went dead before I could respond. Pier 17? That didn't sound like a typical meeting place. But Max wasn't the type to take chances. If he said it was secure, I had to trust him. I grabbed my bag, threw on my jacket, and headed out the door. The drive to the pier felt surreal. It was dusk by the time I got there, the sky a wash of fading orange and purple as the sun sank below the horizon. The pier itself was deserted, save for a few abandoned warehouses that had clearly seen better days. The air smelled of salt water and rust, the faint sound of waves crashing against the docks in the distance. I parked the car and made my way to the warehouse, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. My instincts were on high alert, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The pier was too quiet, too empty. When I reached the door of the warehouse, I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The inside was dimly lit, with long shadows stretching across the floor. Max was there, standing near a stack of crates, his face unreadable. "Max," I called out, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. "What's going on?" He turned toward me, his expression tight. "Ryan, we've got a problem." Before I could ask what he meant, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, only to see a group of men stepping out of the shadows. They were dressed in dark suits, their faces cold and hard. And at the front of the group was Leonard. My blood ran cold. "Well, well," Leonard said, his voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "Looks like you've been busy, Ryan. I have to admit, I didn't think you had it in you." I backed away, glancing at Max, who stood there silently, not meeting my eyes. A sickening realization hit me. Max had betrayed me. The room seemed to close in on me as the reality of the situation hit. Leonard stood there, a smug smile on his face, his entourage looming behind him like a pack of wolves ready to strike. And Max, my friend, the guy I trusted to help me, was just standing there, not saying a word. Betrayal washed over me like ice water. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. "You've been quite the troublemaker, Ryan," Leonard continued, his voice calm, almost amused. "I have to say, I didn't expect you to get this far. But now, well, now we're going to clean up the mess you've made." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "Max, what the hell is this?" Max finally met my eyes, but the look on his face wasn't one of guilt or shame. It was cold, detached. "I'm sorry, Ryan. You've got no idea how deep this goes. Leonard, he's not just some guy running a little money laundering operation. This reaches higher than either of us could ever touch." I shook my head in disbelief, my mind racing. "I trusted you, Max. You were supposed to help me." "I am helping you," he said, but his words felt hollow. "The people Leonard works for, they don't lose. And if you keep pushing, they'll make sure you disappear. This is the best deal you're going to get." "Best deal?" I said, my voice rising with anger. "You call selling me out a deal? You're just as bad as them." Leonard chuckled, taking a step forward. "Max is right, Ryan. You've got two options here. You either walk away, forget about all of this, and live your life quietly. Or," he didn't finish the sentence, but the threat hung in the air like a blade. I knew what he meant. The "or" was simple. I end up dead. They'd make sure I disappeared without a trace, just another casualty in their web of corruption and power. But I wasn't about to back down. Not after everything I'd been through. Not after learning what these people were capable of. My mind was racing, searching for a way out, but the options were few. I was alone, unarmed, and surrounded. And Max, my one ally in this whole mess, had flipped sides. I had no choice but to play it smart. "You think you can just pay me off, threaten me, and that's it?" I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. "You think this is going to end here?" Leonard tilted his head, amused. "You're not in a position to make threats, Ryan." I took a step back, my eyes darting around the room. "No, but I've got one thing you don't." Leonard's smile faded slightly. "And what's that?" I reached into my jacket pocket, pulling out my phone. "Insurance," I said, holding it up. "I've got everything I need to bury you, Leonard. The recordings, the accounts, the names. You can try to take me down, but all it takes is one tap, and this whole thing goes public. The media, the FBI, everyone will know exactly what you and your little friends are doing." Leonard's face darkened. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" I unlocked my phone, showing him the recordings I had saved. "Go ahead, try me. You've already underestimated me once. Let's see how this plays out." For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in Leonard's eyes. He knew that if I made good on my threat, his entire empire could come crashing down. But he wasn't the type to back off easily. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "But let me make this clear. You're playing a dangerous game. And you're in over your head." He signaled to one of his men, who stepped forward, reaching for my phone. But before he could grab it, I took a quick step back, keeping the phone out of reach. I said, my heart pounding. You don't get to touch this. Leonard's expression hardened, and I knew I was walking a tightrope. One wrong move, and they'd take me down right here. But I had to keep the upper hand, at least for now. Max stepped forward, his face tense. Ryan, listen to me. Just give Leonard the phone. You don't have to do this. We can work something out. I stared at Max, my anger boiling over. Work something out? You sold me out, Max. You're no better than the rest of them. I'm trying to save your life, he snapped, his voice sharp with frustration. You have no idea what these people are capable of. I've seen it. I know how this ends if you don't back off. But I wasn't backing off. Not now. Not ever. I had come too far to stop. If I hand this over, I'm dead anyway, Max. So don't stand there and act like you're doing me a favor. Leonard sighed, clearly growing impatient. Enough of this. He motioned to his men again. Take him. The men stepped toward me, but I was ready. In a flash, I shoved the phone into my pocket and bolted toward the nearest exit. I heard Leonard shout, and the sound of footsteps echoed behind me as they gave chase. My heart pounded in my chest as I raced down the pier, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had no plan, no backup, just pure adrenaline driving me forward. I didn't even know where I was running to. All I knew was that I couldn't let them catch me. I reached the end of the pier, skidding to a stop. There was nowhere left to go. The dark water stretched out before me, cold and uninviting. I could hear Leonard's men closing in behind me, their footsteps growing louder. I was trapped. But then, a thought hit me. The water. I had made it across the lake once. Could I make it again? I didn't have time to think it through. Without hesitation, I plunged into the water, the icy shock hitting me like a punch to the chest. My muscles screamed in protest, but I kept going, swimming as hard as I could, putting as much distance between me and the pier as possible. I heard shouting from the shore, but I didn't look back. I just kept swimming, my body fueled by pure survival instinct. The cold water sapped my strength faster than I expected, but I pushed through it, forcing myself to keep moving. Eventually, the sounds behind me faded, and I knew I had escaped. For now, I floated on my back for a moment, catching my breath, staring up at the dark sky. I was alive, but barely, and I knew Leonard wouldn't stop hunting me until he got what he wanted. The game wasn't over. It was just getting started. I floated in the water, my chest heaving as I fought to catch my breath. The adrenaline that had fueled my escape was fading fast, replaced by exhaustion. My limbs were heavy, the cold seeping into my bones, but the distant lights of the shore were still visible. I had no choice but to keep going. Leonard's men wouldn't stop until they found me, and I couldn't afford to let that happen. Every stroke felt like a battle. My muscles screamed with every movement, and the icy water only made it worse. But I pushed through, gritting my teeth as I powered toward the shore. I couldn't let them win, not after everything they'd taken from me. Minutes turned into what felt like hours, and finally, my feet brushed the soft sand beneath the water. I had made it to shore. I dragged myself up onto the beach, collapsing onto my hands and knees, gasping for air. For a moment, I lay there, letting the waves lap at my legs as I stared up at the night sky. I was alive, but I knew that was only temporary if I didn't get moving again. Once I caught my breath, I stumbled to my feet, soaked and shivering, but still determined. There was no turning back now. I had to keep moving, keep running, and find a way to get the recordings to someone who could actually do something with them. But who? Max had betrayed me, and any trust one had in him was gone. That left me with no one. Leonard's reach was long, and I had to assume his network extended deep into law enforcement and other powerful institutions. I couldn't just walk into a police station or send an email to the FBI. I needed someone outside the system, someone who could help me expose all of this without being compromised. As I walked along the dark, deserted road, a plan began to form. I needed to get out of town, maybe out of the state, and find a journalist, someone with a reputation for taking down corrupt people, no matter how powerful they were. If I could get the story into the hands of a credible investigative reporter, it would become too big for Leonard to cover up. Even he couldn't silence the entire media. But first, I needed to disappear, at least long enough to get off Leonard's radar. I couldn't risk using my credit cards, my phone, or any traceable connection. I'd have to go completely dark. Just as I was trying to figure out my next move, headlights appeared in the distance, getting closer. I stepped off the road, moving into the shadows of the trees to avoid being seen. My heart raced as the car slowed, and for a split second, I wondered if it was Leonard's men searching for me. But the car didn't stop. It passed by, the glow of its taillights fading into the distance. I let out a shaky breath, thankful for the momentary reprieve. I couldn't keep running like this. I needed to get to a town, find some clothes, and get dry. I spotted a small gas station up ahead, its flickering neon sign barely visible through the trees. I approached cautiously, keeping my head low as I entered the store. The cashier barely looked up from his magazine as I walked past, and I quickly grabbed a cheap hoodie and sweatpants off the clearance rack. After paying with the last bit of cash I had on me, I ducked into the restroom to change. The dry clothes helped, but I still felt the weight of exhaustion bearing down on me. I couldn't afford to rest, though. Leonard's men were out there, probably combing every corner of the area, and if they found me, it was over. I left the gas station and kept walking down the road, trying to stay out of sight. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a small motel up ahead. The kind of place no one would ask too many questions about a guy paying cash for a room. I ducked inside, paid for a night's stay, and went straight to my room. As soon as I closed the door behind me, I sank onto the bed, my body aching from the swim and the long walk. My mind was racing with everything that had happened. I had the recordings, but what good were they if I couldn't get them to someone who could help? I pulled out my phone, staring at the screen. I couldn't use it to contact anyone without risking being tracked, but the recordings were still there, my only leverage. I had to protect them at all costs. That's when another idea struck me: backup. I quickly accessed a cloud storage service I'd set up years ago and uploaded the recordings, making sure they were encrypted and safe. I didn't know if Leonard or his men could get to my phone, but they weren't going to get to those recordings. I set it up so that if anything happened to me, the files would be automatically sent to several news outlets. Feeling a small sense of relief, I collapsed back onto the bed, letting my eyes close for just a moment. I couldn't afford to sleep, not yet, but exhaustion was pulling me under, and before I knew it, I was out. I woke up to the sound of footsteps outside my motel room. My heart immediately jumped into my throat, my body tensing. I glanced at the clock. It was barely 5 a.m. Whoever it was, they were moving quietly, too quietly for my liking. I slid out of bed, grabbing the small knife I'd swiped from the gas station just in case. As the footsteps grew closer, I moved toward the door, my ears straining to hear any other sounds. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, then louder, more urgent. I stayed still, my heart pounding in my chest, praying that whoever it was would just go away. But they didn't. "Ryan," a familiar voice called through the door. "Open up. It's Max." My grip on the knife tightened. Max, the man who had sold me out to Leonard. The last person I wanted to see right now. "Go away, Max." I hissed through the door. "I've got nothing to say to you." "Listen," Max said, his voice low and tense. "I know I screwed up, but you have to hear me out. I didn't have a choice, Ryan. Leonard has people everywhere. You're not safe. I'm not safe. None of us are." I stayed silent, unsure of whether to believe him. After what he did, I couldn't trust him, but something in his voice sounded different. Desperate. "I know I messed up," he continued, "but I'm trying to make it right. There's a lot more going on here than you realize, Ryan. It's not just Leonard. There are bigger players involved. I can help you. Please, just open the door." I hesitated, my mind racing. Max had already betrayed me once, but if what he was saying was true, I needed to know more. I needed to know who was pulling the strings behind Leonard, the people who were really in control. After a moment, I slowly unlocked the door and cracked it open, just enough to see Max's face. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days, and there was a nervous energy about him that I hadn't seen before. "Make it quick," I said, keeping my grip on the knife hidden behind the door. Max nodded. glancing around as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. "Leonard knows about the recordings," he said. "He's got people tracking your every move. But it's not just him. There are others. High-level government officials, powerful business figures. They're all part of this." My heart sank. I had known Leonard was dangerous, but I hadn't realized just how deep this went. "What do you want, Max?" "I want to help you," he said, his voice earnest. "I want to take them down, too. But I can't do it alone. I have access to information you don't, and I know how to get to the people pulling the strings. But we need to work together." I stared at him, still unsure whether to believe him. After what he had done, trusting him felt like a huge risk. But I was running out of options. And if what he was saying was true, I couldn't take on this fight alone. "All right," I said slowly. "But if you screw me over again, Max, I swear." "I won't," he cut in, raising his hands. "I'm in this as deep as you are now. There's no turning back." I stepped aside, letting him into the room. It was a gamble, but at this point, it was a risk I had to take. Max stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the cramped space before he turned back to me. The tension between us was thick, and I still held the knife tightly behind my back, not willing to let my guard down yet. He glanced at the bed where I had been lying, his brow furrowing slightly as if he was piecing together just how much I had been through. "I know you do not trust me," he said, his voice low. "And honestly, I cannot blame you. But believe me when I say that I'm not working for Leonard anymore. Things have spiraled way beyond what I expected." I crossed my arms, my face hard. "Cut the excuses, Max. Just tell me why you're really here." Max exhaled, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "All right, you want the truth? Here it is. Leonard has lost control. The people backing him, they are much more powerful than I realized. We are talking about top-tier government officials, CEOs, foreign investors, and they are all tied to a network that launders billions of dollars. It's not just about money either. It's influence, blackmail, control." I frowned. "What do they want with me? Why go through all this trouble?" Max rubbed the back of his neck. "Because you stumbled into something that could blow it all apart. The recordings you have, those names you heard, are just the tip of the iceberg. If those names get out, it could unravel everything they've built. That's why they sent Leonard after you. And that's why they sent me." "Sent you?" I repeated, my voice sharp. "You said you were trying to help me, Max." "I am," he insisted. "But at first, they wanted me to keep you under control. Make sure you did not get too far with what you had. But now I see how dangerous they really are, Ryan. We are both in the crosshairs, and if we don't play this right, neither of us will make it out alive." I shook my head, pacing the small room. "And why should I believe a word you are saying? You already sold me out once." Max held up his hands, his face a mix of frustration and urgency. "Because I have information you need. And because I am your best shot at getting out of this. Look, I know I screwed up, but I did not realize how big this was at first. Now I do. And I'm telling you, we can bring them down together." "Together?" I scoffed. "How do you suggest we do that, Max? I'm one guy with some recordings. They have money, power, and people everywhere." "I have a plan," Max said, lowering his voice as if he was afraid someone might be listening. "We need to turn the tables on them. Use their own network against them." I narrowed my eyes. "How?" Max stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. "There is someone high up, a whistleblower. Someone who has been feeding me information for months, long before I got involved with Leonard. They are on the inside of this entire operation, and they are willing to testify. But we have to get to them first." "Where are they?" I asked, my interest piqued despite my skepticism. "DC," Max said. "They've been hiding in plain sight, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to come forward. If we can get to them, and if we can make sure your recordings line up with what they have, we can blow this whole thing wide open. But it won't be easy. Leonard's people are watching everyone, especially me. If they get wind of what we are doing, it's game over." I took a deep breath, my mind racing. This was a lot to take in. On one hand, Max had already betrayed me once. On the other, he was right about one thing. I could not take down Leonard and his backers on my own. I needed help, and as much as I hated to admit it, Max might be my only shot. "All right," I said finally. We do this your way. But if I get even the slightest hint that you are screwing me over again, I'll make sure those recordings go public in an instant. Max nodded. Fair enough. But trust me, Ryan, we are in this together now. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the weight of the situation crashing down on me. This was real. This was happening. I had stumbled into something far bigger than I ever imagined, and now my life was on the line. Max pulled a small laptop from his bag and opened it on the table. I've been keeping tabs on them, he said, typing quickly. They've ramped up surveillance, so we'll need to be careful. But if we can get to our guy in DC, we'll have everything we need. How do we even get there without being followed? I asked. We can't take a direct route, Max replied, glancing up at me. They'll have eyes on all the main highways, airports, bus terminals. But I have a contact who owes me a favor, a pilot. He can fly us under the radar, no questions asked. It is a risk, but it is our best shot. I nodded slowly. It was risky, but at this point, everything was. When do we leave? Max looked at his watch. Tonight. I will make the call, and we can be airborne by midnight. If we pull this off, by the time the sun rises, we will be in DC, ready to meet with the whistleblower. I felt a knot of tension coil in my stomach, but I forced myself to push it aside. This was my only option. I had to trust that Max was telling the truth, even if every instinct told me not to. Let's do it, I said. Max made the call, speaking in quick, hushed tones. After a few minutes, he hung up and turned to me. We are set. The plane will be ready in a few hours. I'll give you the details on the way. I gathered my things, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. We were about to dive headfirst into the heart of a conspiracy that stretched farther than I could have imagined. And if we failed, I knew we wouldn't live to see another day. As midnight approached, we drove to a small, private airstrip outside of town. The place was deserted except for a single plane sitting on the tarmac, its lights dimmed to avoid attention. The pilot, a grizzled man in his 50s with a thick beard, greeted us with a nod. No questions, he muttered, leading us to the plane. You pay, I fly. That's the deal. Max handed him a wad of cash, and within minutes, we were airborne, the small plane cutting through the night sky. I stared out the window, the dark landscape below slipping away as we flew toward DC. My mind raced with everything that had happened and everything still to come. We were heading straight into the belly of the beast, and I had no idea what awaited us on the other side. Max sat beside me, his eyes focused on the horizon. You ready for this? He asked quietly. I nodded, though my stomach was in knots. I don't have a choice. He gave me a tight smile. Neither do I. The plane droned on through the night, the weight of what we were about to face settling over us like a storm cloud. We were two men up against a network of some of the most powerful people in the world. But we had the truth on our side, and that was something. As the lights of DC came into view in the distance, I clenched my fists, steeling myself for what was to come. This was it, the moment of truth. There was no turning back now. We were about to go to war.